Before idolatry, before organized religions, before the confusion of divine names and pantheons invented by men, there existed a real, conscious and forbidden pact between rebellious celestial beings and humanity. It was not a poetic metaphor to explain the origin of evil. It was not a myth created to give meaning to human suffering. It was not symbolic. It was not allegorical. It was not a later literary construct. It was a deliberate agreement, witnessed, recorded, and condemned by heaven. What is preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, specifically in the Book of Enoch, is not religious folklore or mystical speculation, but the account of a cosmic transgression whose consequences shaped the history of humanity and whose final judgment still awaits resolution. This is not an invitation to curiosity. It is the exposition of an event whose nature has been systematically obscured, romanticized, and then erased from official narratives, but which remains inscribed in the deepest layers of human spiritual memory. The full understanding of this pact is only revealed at the end, when the connection between the angelic rebellion and the eschatological judgment becomes evident. The consequence of this agreement did not dissolve with the flood, nor was it annulled by the passage of time. It still governs invisible structures of the world, manifests itself in patterns of corruption that span millennia, and awaits its definitive annulment at the return of the Messiah as judge. The final revelation of this account connects the forbidden pact to the apocalypse, demonstrating that the end times are not a divine surprise, but the calculated conclusion of a process begun before the flood. Stay until the end, not for entertainment, but because understanding this sequence alters your perception of the nature of evil, the origin of human knowledge, and the purpose of the coming judgment. According to the Book of Enoch in Ethiopian tradition, the Watchers were a specific order of angelic beings whose primary function was to observe humanity without directly interfering in its development. They were not gods. They did not possess creative authority. They had no dominion over matter, nor sovereignty over human destinies. Their position was subordinate to the throne of God, their existence defined by obedience to a clear celestial mandate: to watch, to witness, to report. The Hebrew term used in ancient traditions to designate them, Urim, carries precisely this sense of designated observers, passive agents of the divine will, charged with monitoring the human experiment without contaminating its results. The fall of the Watchers did not stem from a desire to usurp God's power, as in the case of Lucifer, but from something more subtle and more dangerous: the desire for interference, for crossing boundaries, for violating the established limits between the celestial and the earthly. They did not want to replace God. They wanted to corrupt his creation. The descent to Mount Hermon, as recorded in Enoch 6, was not an impulsive act, nor an accidental fall caused by momentary temptation. It was a deliberate, planned conspiracy, sealed by a collective oath among 200 watchers who decided by mutual agreement to transgress the divine mandate. Mount Hermon, located on the border between present-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, was chosen as the point of descent, not by geographical chance, but for its symbolic significance. It was a boundary mountain, a border space, a place that marked the transition between the ordered world and the territory not yet fully subjected to human governance. There, on the summit of that mountain, the 200 watchers made an oath among themselves. According to the text of Enoch, they feared that by committing the transgression individually, some might back down in the face of the consequences, leaving the others exposed to divine judgment. Therefore, they sealed a binding pact. All would fall together, all would share the guilt, all would face condemnation collectively. The oath was pronounced by name, word, and commitment. Each watcher invoked their own identity, linked their destiny to that of the others, and accepted the irreversibility of the act they were about to perform. The pact was not initially made with humans, but among the Watchers themselves. Only after sealing the agreement amongst themselves did they descend to consummate the transgression, taking human women as wives, generating hybrid offspring, and, crucially, transmitting forbidden knowledge to humanity. It is at this point that the pact extends from heaven to earth, ceasing to be merely an angelic conspiracy and becoming an agreement involving two distinct natures, the celestial and the earthly, in an unauthorized fusion. The text of Enoch is explicit in listing the names of the leaders of this rebellion: Shemihaza, Arachiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barachiel, Asael, Armaros, Batariel, Ananiel, Zachiel, Samsiel, Satariel, Turiel, Yomiel, Sariel. Each of these names carries in its Hebrew etymology a specific function or attribute, suggesting that the rebellion was not chaotic, but organized according to specializations. Each watcher had something specific to offer humanity, something that was outside of the original divine plan for human development. The content of the Forbidden Pact, as detailed in Enoch 8, reveals exactly what was transmitted to humanity. Isael, one of the leaders, taught men the manufacture of weapons: swords, knives, shields, breastplates, instruments of war that did not exist before. He also revealed metals and the process of their extraction and working, introducing military metallurgy. Shemihaza taught enchantments and root cutting, knowledge linked to magic and the manipulation of natural forces for supernatural purposes. Armaros taught the dissolution of enchantments, counter-magic. Barachiel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the signs, the reading of celestial omens. Tamiel taught applied astronomy. Azradel taught the course of the moon and its influence on terrestrial cycles. All this knowledge, although it may seem neutral or even beneficial from a modern perspective, is presented in the text of Enoch as transgressions, as violations of limits imposed by God. The question was not whether knowledge itself was good or bad, but whether humanity was ready to receive it, and whether it should receive it from rebellious celestial beings instead of developing it organically under divine guidance. But the most disturbing aspect of the pact was not the technical knowledge. It was the knowledge related to seduction, vanity, and the manipulation of appearance. Enoch records that the Watchers taught women the use of cosmetics, the beautification with antimony around the eyes, the use of precious stones and dyes. They taught the art of calculated seduction, the manipulation of perception through appearance, transforming natural beauty into an instrument of power and control. This was not simply superficial vanity. It was the introduction of a new social dynamic based on illusion, artifice, and sensory manipulation. Humanity was taught to wear masks, to create personas, to conceal its essence under layers of artifice. And here lies one of the central points of divine judgment against the Pact. It not only accelerated human technological development, but corrupted humanity's relationship with itself, with truth, with transparency before God. The spiritual price paid by humanity quickly became evident. Knowledge was not neutral. It came accompanied by guidance, a philosophy, a worldview that radically contrasted with God's original plan for humanity. The Watchers did not merely transmit information, they transmitted values, priorities, a hierarchy of importance that placed power, appearance, control, and manipulation above righteousness, truth, and submission to the Creator. The text of Enoch makes it clear that the corruption was progressive, not instantaneous. First came knowledge, then came the application of knowledge, then came the normalization of application, then came dependence, and finally came the worship of the instructors themselves. subsequent generations of humans began to revere the Watchers as gods, to invoke their names, to build altars in their honor, to offer sacrifices in exchange for more knowledge and protection. The covenant transformed into a cult. The effect on humanity and creation as a whole was catastrophic. Enoch 7 describes the emergence of the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers and human women. These beings, endowed with superhuman strength and uncontrolled appetites, consumed everything around them. When natural resources were depleted, they turned against humans themselves, devouring them. Violence multiplied exponentially. Innocent blood cried out to heaven. The earth was corrupted not only morally, but physically, materially, and ecologically. The balance of creation was broken. Plants and animals were subjected to experiments, unnatural crossbreeding, and manipulations that generated aberrations. The text suggests that the Watchers and their offspring were not content with corrupting humanity, but extended their interference to all forms of terrestrial life, violating the boundaries between species, producing monstrous hybrids that had no place in the original creative plan. This is the direct connection to the days of Noah. When the New Testament mentions that the days of Christ's return will be like the days of Noah, it is not referring merely to widespread unbelief or to everyday normalcy interrupted by sudden judgment. It is referring to the specific state of corruption that characterized the antediluvian world, the mixing of celestial and earthly, the breaking of the limits imposed by God, the worship of beings that should not be worshipped, the use of forbidden knowledge for destructive purposes, systemic violence, and the total degradation of creation. The flood was not a disproportionate punishment. It was the only appropriate response to a situation in which the very integrity of creation was compromised. God did not destroy humanity for common moral sins. He destroyed a humanity that had been genetically, spiritually, and culturally corrupted to the point that it could no longer fulfill its original purpose. The flood was simultaneously judgment and purification, punishment and a new beginning, an end and a safeguard. God's direct intervention was not limited to the flood. Before the flood, according to Enoch 10, God sent archangels to execute specific judgment upon the Watchers and their descendants. Raphael was sent to bind Asahel and cast him into the darkness of the desert of Dudael, where he would remain imprisoned until the day of final judgment. Gabriel was sent to destroy the Nephilim, inciting them against one another until they annihilated each other. Michael was sent to bind Shemi-Hazah and the other conspiring Watchers, binding them under the hills of the earth for 70 generations until the day of judgment. These judgments were not symbolic. They were literal executions of divine sentences against beings who had broken the cosmic order. The Watchers were not annihilated immediately because their final judgment was reserved for a specific moment in the future, a moment when all creation would witness their ultimate condemnation. But what human texts omitted was precisely this dimension of judgment. Ancient cultures that inherited fragments of the Watchers' memory transformed these rebellious beings into founding gods, civilizing heroes, bearers of divine gifts to humanity. Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek mythology all preserve distorted echoes of this original event. The Mesopotamian Anunnaki, often interpreted by modern theories as extraterrestrial visitors, are probably cultural reflections of the Watchers, rebellious celestial beings who descended, interfered, and were judged. The Greek Titans who warred against the Olympian gods and were imprisoned in Tartarus reflect the same pattern. Powerful beings predating the current order, who transgressed, were defeated, and imprisoned, awaiting judgment. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give it to men and was chained to a rock as punishment, is another variation on the same theme. Forbidden knowledge transmitted to humanity by a rebellious celestial being, followed by perpetual damnation. The pact was romanticized. Transgression was reinterpreted as a heroic act. The Watchers became benefactors, not criminals. Humanity began to celebrate the knowledge received without questioning its origin or consequences. Divine judgment was erased from the narrative or transformed into the tyranny of jealous gods who did not want humanity to ascend. This inversion was not accidental. It was progressive, systematic, and reflects the very nature of the corruption introduced by the Watchers, the substitution of truth for convenient narrative, of reality for illusion, of divine judgment for human autonomy. The mystery religions of the ancient world, which promised secret knowledge and initiation into hidden truths, perpetuated this same pattern. The idea that there is a superior knowledge, reserved for a few, that liberates from ignorance and elevates the initiate above the common mass. This is the direct legacy of the Forbidden Pact. The Ethiopian Bible preserved the uncorrupted version of this event because the Ethiopian Church maintained the Book of Enoch in its official canon when all other Christian traditions removed it or relegated it to apocryphal text. The reason for this preservation was not accidental. Ethiopia was Christianized in the 4th century and developed its own theological tradition, less influenced by the Roman and Byzantine councils that determined which books would be considered inspired. For the Ethiopian Church, Enoch was always scripture, and its removal from the Western canon was seen as a loss, not a correction. Enoch's role as an eyewitness to this event is fundamental. He did not record rumors or distant oral traditions. He witnessed it directly, was taken to heaven, received revelations from the archangels themselves about what had happened and what the ultimate fate of the Watchers would be. His testimony is not mythological, it is forensic. But the pact did not end with the flood. Its effects permeate human history to the present day. The structure of forbidden knowledge, the seduction of hidden power, the promise of transcendence through secret techniques, the manipulation of matter for purposes that violate ethical boundaries. All of this remains active. The Watchers are imprisoned, the Nephilim have been destroyed, but the seed of the pact continues to germinate. Each generation rediscovers in different ways the same temptation: to acquire knowledge that should not be acquired, to manipulate forces that should not be manipulated, to cross boundaries that should not be crossed. The definitive resolution of this cycle is linked to the return of the Messiah, not as a merciful savior, but as the judge executing the sentence long pronounced against the Watchers and all who perpetuated their legacy. The judgment of the Watchers is explicitly taken up again in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude, verses 6 and 7, declares, "And the angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling place, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness for the judgment of the great day." This passage makes no sense without the context of Enoch. Jude is directly quoting the Enochian tradition, confirming that the rebellious angels mentioned are the Watchers, that they were imprisoned after their transgression, and that they await a specific final judgment. The following verse connects this angelic rebellion to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, suggesting a recurring pattern: transgression of natural boundaries, radical moral corruption, judgment by fire. Peter, in his second epistle, chapter 2, verse 4, reinforces this. "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them down to hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, to be kept until the judgment." Again, the language is unequivocal. There are specific angels who sinned in a particular way, were imprisoned under specific conditions, and await future judgment. Christ assumes the role of judge of these beings in the eschatological context. The Apocalypse of John explicitly uses the language and imagery of Enoch: the fallen angels, the beasts that rise from the abyss, the dragon chained for 1,000 years and then briefly released before the final judgment. All of this directly echoes the Enochian narrative. Revelation 20 describes an angel descending from heaven with the key to the abyss and a great chain binding the dragon for 1,000 years. This temporary imprisonment, followed by brief release and definitive judgment, exactly reflects the pattern established in Enoch. The Watchers were imprisoned for 70 generations, but will be released briefly before the final judgment, so that all creation may witness their condemnation. The covenant is officially annulled not at the moment of imprisonment, but at the moment of the definitive judgment, when Christ, as judge, declares the irreversible sentence. The language of Enoch reappears in the New Testament so consistently that it is impossible to ignore the theological continuity. When Jesus speaks of the days of Noah, when Paul mentions principalities and powers, when John describes war in heaven, when Jude quotes Enoch by name, all these texts are operating within the same interpretative framework. There is an ongoing cosmic history, begun before the flood, involving angelic rebellion, human corruption, divine judgment, and final restoration. The New Testament does not invent this structure. It assumes it as known and completes it, revealing that Christ is the central agent of this resolution. He is not only the savior of humanity, he is the executor of judgment against the rebellious celestial powers that corrupted humanity. The final revelation is this: the pact was forbidden because it fundamentally altered the order of creation established by God. It was not merely a matter of moral disobedience. It was an ontological, structural, cosmic issue. The Watchers introduced elements into earthly creation that did not belong there, knowledge and techniques that accelerated developments for which humanity was not spiritually prepared, genetic crossbreeding that violated the boundaries between species established by God. The knowledge delivered did not liberate humanity. It imprisoned it. It created dependence, corruption, violence, and ultimately, self-destruction. The Watcher's promise was ascension. The result was degradation. The promise was enlightenment. The result was darkness. The promise was divinity. The result was bestiality. Knowledge was not neutral because it came laden with intention. The Watchers did not transmit wisdom. They transmitted techniques disconnected from wisdom, power disconnected from responsibility, ability disconnected from divine purpose. They taught men how to kill efficiently, how to manipulate appearances, how to read the heavens for selfish ends, how to control natural forces without reverence for the Creator. Each fragment of knowledge transmitted contained an implicit lie. The lie that humanity could be like God without God, that knowledge alone was salvation, that the limits imposed by the Creator were arbitrary and oppressive. This is the same lie uttered in Eden: "You shall be like God." The serpent did not invent this lie. The Watchers made it a reality. The covenant not only corrupted the antediluvian generation, it anticipated judgment. It made judgment inevitable. God could not allow corruption to continue indefinitely without completely destroying his creative purpose. The flood was not an emotional reaction. It was a necessary surgical intervention to preserve the possibility of future redemption. If the Watchers had continued, if the Nephilim had multiplied, if forbidden knowledge had spread unchecked, there would have been no more humanity to redeem. There would only be corrupted hybrids, demon worshippers, practitioners of abominations, descendants of forbidden crossbreeds with no possibility of return. The flood saved humanity by destroying humanity. It saved Noah and his family because they preserved genetic and spiritual integrity. The text of Genesis is explicit. Noah was perfect in his generations, not morally perfect, but genetically whole, uncontaminated by crossbreeding with the Watchers. The end times, therefore, are no surprise. It is the culmination of an ancient process. Post-flood human history is not random. It is the unfolding of consequences established before the flood. The powers and principalities mentioned by Paul are not abstractions. They are real spiritual structures, angelic hierarchies that, although they did not directly participate in the Watchers' rebellion, were affected by it and now operate in a corrupted cosmos. The spiritual battle described in the New Testament did not begin with Christ. Christ entered a war already underway, a war initiated when the Watchers descended on Mount Hermon. His mission was not only to redeem humanity from the original sin committed in Eden, but to restore the cosmic order broken by the Watchers, to execute the long-delayed judgment, and to establish a new heaven and a new earth where the separation between celestial and earthly is maintained according to the original plan. The second coming of Christ, in this context, is not merely to gather his church or judge the nations. It is to execute the final sentence against the imprisoned Watchers, definitively annul the forbidden covenant, completely eradicate the effects of antediluvian corruption, and restore creation to its original integrity. Revelation 20 describes this moment precisely. After the millennium, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations. But he will be definitively defeated and cast into the lake of fire along with the beast and the false prophet. The Watchers and all beings who participated in the original rebellion will also be cast there. The lake of fire is not excessive punishment. It is the necessary annihilation of elements that cannot be redeemed, that have no place in the new creation. The Ethiopian Bible preserved what others concealed, not by historical accident, but because the complete truth about the origin of evil, the nature of the angelic rebellion, and the divine plan of restoration requires the testimony of Enoch. Without Enoch, Genesis 6 remains enigmatic. Without Enoch, the references of Jude and Peter are out of context. Without Enoch, the apocalyptic language of John loses half its meaning. Without Enoch, the connection between the days of Noah and the days of Christ's return remains obscure. The removal of Enoch from the Western canon was not theological improvement, it was impoverishment. It was a loss of clarity on fundamental issues. It was the replacement of concrete revelation with theological speculation. These texts are not historical curiosities. They are not interesting but irrelevant ancient literature. They are not comparative mythology or religious folklore. They are an active warning. The pattern established by the Watchers continues to repeat itself. Promises of liberating knowledge, techniques that elevate, powers that deify. Each era rediscovers its own version of the forbidden pact. The modern era is no exception. Genetic manipulation, artificial intelligence that promises transcendence, transhumanisms that promise overcoming human limitations, technologies that promise immortality, all echo the same pattern, crossing boundaries that should not be crossed, the pursuit of knowledge disconnected from wisdom, power disconnected from submission to the Creator. The pattern of corruption, introduced by the Watchers, manifests itself not only in specific technologies or knowledge, but in the very structure of human thought after the Pact. The idea that there are secret paths to divinity, that hidden knowledge elevates above the common, that limits are obstacles to be overcome and not borders to be respected. All this derives directly from the agreement sealed on Mount Hermon. The secret societies that have traversed human history, promising enlightenment to initiates, are echoes of this same structure. The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, the cults of Isis in Egypt, the Gnostic schools that proliferated in the first centuries of Christianity, the medieval esoteric orders, all operated under the same premise. There is a superior knowledge, transmitted from master to disciple, that liberates the masses from ignorance. This premise is not neutral. It is the perpetuation of the Watcher's original lie. Human fascination with forbidden knowledge is not natural intellectual curiosity. It is a spiritual scar left by the Pact. Every generation faces its own version of temptation. Knowledge that promises power without responsibility. Technology that promises control without submission to the Creator. Ability that promises transcendence without moral transformation. Medieval alchemy sought to transmute metals and prolong life indefinitely. The scientific revolution promised complete dominion over nature. The atomic age brought the power of absolute destruction. Contemporary biotechnology offers to redesign life at the genetic level. Artificial intelligence promises to create synthetic consciousness. Each advance carries the same unanswered question: should we do everything we can do? The absence of this question is a symptom of the original corruption. The Nephilim were not merely physical giants. They were symbols of a humanity that surpassed its natural limits, that became something it should not be. Enoch's description of their insatiable appetite is not literary exaggeration. It is an accurate characterization of what happens when the human mixes with the celestial without divine authorization. Something hybrid emerges, displaced, without a legitimate place in the created order, perpetually dissatisfied because its very existence violates the established balance. The Nephilim consumed everything because they could not be satisfied. Their hunger was not merely physical, it was ontological. They were beings who should not exist, trying to fill an existential void impossible to fill. When they consumed all resources, they turned against humans because their hybrid nature placed them in permanent war against the natural order. They were literally abominations, not only in a moral sense, but in a structural, cosmological sense. The destruction of the Nephilim before the flood, carried out by Gabriel through fratricidal war, was not divine cruelty, it was mercy. These beings could not be redeemed because their very nature was corruption. There was no possible salvation for an unauthorized hybrid between celestial and earthly. The only option was annihilation. And yet the text of Enoch suggests that the spirits of the Nephilim, after their physical death, remained active on earth as demons, disembodied entities perpetually in conflict with humanity. If this reading is correct, then the demons mentioned in the New Testament are not simply fallen angels, but the spirits of the dead Nephilim, descendants of the Watchers, still operating on earth, even after the judgment of their progenitors. This explains why the demons, upon encountering Christ in the Gospels, immediately recognize his authority and fear the coming judgment. They know they are survivors of a previous condemnation, awaiting final execution. The preaching of Christ to the spirits in prison, mentioned by Peter, takes on new meaning in this context. It was not an offer of redemption to the imprisoned Watchers, but a proclamation of victory. Christ descended to the place of their imprisonment to declare that the plan of human redemption had been completed despite the corruption they introduced, that humanity would be restored, and that their final judgment was confirmed and irreversible. It was an act of triumph, not evangelization. The Watchers have no redemption available. Their sentence was pronounced before the flood and will be executed at the end of time. The reason the knowledge transmitted by the Watchers was forbidden lies not only in its content, but in its origin and purpose. God had established a process of human development that included gradual discovery, organic learning, and growth that accompanied spiritual maturity. The Watchers disrupted this process, delivering advanced knowledge to a spiritually immature humanity, creating a catastrophic imbalance between technical ability and moral wisdom. It's like giving nuclear weapons to children. The catastrophe is not a matter of if, but when. Antediluvian humanity received the power to manipulate matter, control natural processes, and manufacture devastating weapons, all without having developed the character necessary to use this power responsibly. The result was inevitable, exponential violence, total corruption, and imminent self-destruction. This pattern repeats itself. Each era rediscovers its own version of the dilemma. The 20th century saw the creation of weapons capable of exterminating all human life on Earth. Technical development dramatically outpaced moral development. Humanity gained the power of total destruction without acquiring proportional wisdom. The result was 2 world wars, industrialized genocides, holocausts, extermination camps, and atomic bombs dropped on civilian populations. Scientific knowledge, divorced from moral wisdom, produced unimaginable horrors. Not because science is evil, but because knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. The scientists who developed the first atomic weapons, witnessing the tests, cited Hindu scriptures about cosmic destruction. They recognized too late that they had crossed a boundary that perhaps should not have been crossed. They had become, in Oppenheimer's words, death, destroyers of worlds. The contemporary era faces similar dilemmas multiplied. Biotechnology allows for the genetic editing of human embryos. Artificial intelligence is approaching capabilities that will rival human intelligence. Nanotechnology promises molecular control of matter. Nuclear fusion offers almost unlimited